So this is our final video of the classical and medieval Britain. And in this video, we will be examining the Black Death. So the last invasion of the medieval era was not by human, but by disease. So up to this point, England had been ruled by the Norman conquerors since 1066. And by 1348 AD, the country is reasonably stable nationally, and it was becoming a competent trading country, especially with the other medieval European powers. There is, at this time, an ongoing war with France, and actually that war with France ultimately lasts for over 100 years. So at this time, religion had taken hold in the form of Catholicism, and the Catholic priests took many roles in society. Those roles were spiritual advisors, teachers, and often healers. So at that time, England didn't practice very well developed medical practices, and they often relied on local knowledge of herbs and very basic rudimentary surgery. The priests were seen as healers, and actually, relative to the time, the church was a great component of the sciences. So this meant that the priests often had the most up-to-date knowledge of procedures and treatments, but all that meant was, the procedures weren't that developed. They were just as up to date as they knew at the time. So the Black Death itself arrived in 1348 AD on a ship from Gascony, France, to the south of England. So this was the first recorded case at this time. And from here, it was spread to other fishing communities through traders and fishermen. And fishing ships would catch fish out to seas, and they would sell them in various areas of the south. And importantly, the disease then spread up the country via the trading ships. So the Black Death infected England very quickly, although London was one of the last cities to escape the outbreak. But of course, eventually even London was overcome. So after England, Wales and then Scotland were infected. And after 500 days in total, it had basically spread to all parts of the country. So the timeline of the disease was as follows. In 1348 AD, it arrived from just south of France. And in June 1348, it kind of entered southern England. By August 1348, London became infected. And by summer 1349 AD, all of England was infected. The entire country had become infected. We have fairly accurate records of the Black Death from the record keeping the Normans started in 1066. So there are records for the number of wills made for people dying, and also records of priests' death and church vacancies for new priests in an area. So medical practices at the time, as I mentioned, were fairly basic, and they often relied on local knowledges and practices. So I want to look a little bit about these practices. So the common practices at the time were bloodletting. So bloodletting is the practice of bleeding the patient with needles or leeches, and the idea was to draw out any poisons or toxins through the blood. So this was a very common treatment for many diseases and fevers at the time. Also used were onions and vinegars, and they were used to clean the area and to draw out any toxins as well. Snakes and chickens were used to specifically heal a person of the Black Death. But of course, these practices had very little actual medical value and were more superstitious. Similar strange medical practices were the drinking of unicorn horns. And this was available for rich people. Now, of course, unicorns don't exist. So these unicorn horns were probably rhino horns that had arrived from the Silk Road trade route. But really, it's impossible to know for sure what exactly it was. Either way, though, we can assume the medical uses are quite limited. Such practices came from very little knowledge of sanitation and very little knowledge of how diseases are spread. Towards the end, people did start to quarantine, but this was almost a side product of trying not to leave their houses or have contact with anyone, as they knew that to meet people would mean a risk of catching the disease. So this kind of quarantine eventually meant that the disease actually came under relative control. So the consequences of the Black Death were enormous. On average, around 40 to 50% of the population were killed, and this had an effect on almost every aspect of regular life. So religion and religion practices became more apparent, and people started adapting their religion to become more personal than religion was previously. So this was an important change to the way people worshipped. Usually the Catholic priest would give all of the information to the people. The people themselves wouldn't need to read the Bible or have any knowledge of it intimately. So this kind of guidance to worship changed slightly with so many dead or in quarantine. So people started developing their own medical practices, and some of these were pretty extreme. Due to the shortage of manpower, this led to huge gaps in the workforce. So there were not enough people to farm or do any hard physical labor. So this really had two important effects on English society. These effects were as such. The first one was that the ruling class had to do some of the work themselves, as they didn't have enough people to work on their land. And the second effect was the people still alive, they wanted higher wages than they had before, because often they had to work longer, and it was easy for them to find other work, unlike before the disease. So the second effect resulted in the English government passing a law saying wages should remain the same as before the disease. This led to regular workers seeing this as a protection of the ruling classes, and this caused a small rebellion in which the workers refused to work for the lower wages. Eventually, this pay was increased. So the first effect caused the ruling class to often perform in a job poorly. The ruling classes were not used to working, but of course, a lack of workers and increased wages for those workers meant they really had very little choice. However, they took jobs as civil servants and law enforcement, and they were often corrupt and lazy. Finally, the shortage of manpower meant a suspension of wars with France. So practically neither England nor France could get enough men together to make an army to fight a battle. So until 1355 AD, actually no wars took place in Europe. So in summary, the Black Death altered English society in many ways, and it never really returned after the Black Death had passed. The enormous death rate meant industries had slowed down, taxes were decreased, and people became more personally religious. Medically, people started to realize that isolation and quarantine were some of the best practices to treat pandemic-like illnesses.